Imagine being a young Christian in the first century, living in a world where his faith could cost him everything: family, friends, and even his own life. Now think of someone who, despite all the difficulties, has decided to stay firm, face persecution, and carry the responsibility of leading a church in turbulent times. This was Timothy. From early age, he was shaped by faith, but his journey was far from easy. Growing up in an environment of mixed cultures, he had to overcome social challenges and prove his leadership in a hostile world to the gospel. Under Paul's guidance, he learned the true meaning of discipleship and pastoral ministry. But could a young man carry such a large burden? In this video, you will learn about Timothy's inspiring history, an unlikely leader who challenged expectations, fought heresies, faced persecution, and left an eternal Christian legacy. In the end, you will see how the principles he followed can transform your life today. Prepare for a journey full of challenges, unshakable faith, and lessons that continue to echo to this day. Timothy was born in Strype, a small and little expressive town in the Roman world. His father was Greek, a pagan man, and his mother, Eunice, was a devout Jew. This mixture of cultures shaped his childhood, but also brought challenges. After all, in a society marked by traditions and prejudices, a young man of mixed origin could find it difficult to be accepted. However, his mother and grandmother, Aloyne, did not let it move him away from faith. From an early age, they taught the scriptures, planting the seeds of truth in him. While other children ran through the striped streets involving games, Timothy grew listening to stories of Abraham, Moses, and David. For him, God's word was not just an abstract teaching, but a reality that shaped his worldview. Perhaps at that time, he didn't know yet, but these lessons would be essential to his future journey. As they say, train a child on the path where it should walk, and even when you get older, you won't be diverted to him. And this training started early in your life. But do not think that this formation happened without challenges. Growing up in an environment dominated by Greek and Roman culture, Timothy lived in the midst of pagan beliefs and philosophies that contradicted everything his family taught him. Many young Jews of the time ended up seduced by this influence and moved away from the faith of their parents. But Timothy was different. He absorbed the teachings he received and kept them in his heart. His faith was not superficial, a firm conviction that would accompany him for the rest of his life. What made the difference? The discipleship indoors. Eunice and Loin not only taught the word, but lived according to it. This coherence impacted Timothy in a way that no pagan philosophy could erase. This teaches us something powerful. It is not enough to talk about God. We need to demonstrate it with our attitudes. And it was so, in the family environment, that Timothy began to develop a solid character, which would later prepare it for much larger challenges. Without realizing it, Timothy was being shaped for a greater purpose. His heart was already being prepared for a call that would change his life forever. But he still had no idea that soon a man named Paul would cross his way and completely transform his destiny. Growing up in Strype was not simple for someone like Timothy. The city, though small, was immersed in Greco-Roman culture. Pagan philosophies, cults to foreign gods, and a lifestyle distant from Jewish principles were part of everyday life. As the son of a Greek and a Jew, he saw himself between two worlds without completely belonging to any. For the most rigorous Jews, their mixed origin could be seen as a problem. For the Greeks, their connection with Judaism could seem a weakness. This duality shaped his childhood and adolescence. Imagine tension while your mother and grandmother taught him about the God of Israel and the promises of Scripture. Her city promoted pagan festivals and idolatric rituals. Early on, Timothy had to learn to balance his faith in the midst of a hostile environment. Many in their place could have deviated themselves, embraced the dominant culture, and put the teachings aside. But he remained firm. This resistance already demonstrated the strong character he would later develop as a Christian leader. In addition to the cultural challenges, there was also social pressures. As a young Jew in a city dominated by Greek culture, he could have been moved or even rejected. After all, it was not completely accepted on one side or on the other. This feeling of not belonging can be difficult for anyone. However, instead of becoming an obstacle, this has become a preparation. In living with different perspectives, Timothy learned to communicate with everyone, an essential ability for the pastoral ministry that he would exert in the future. His challenges in youth taught him not to be shaken by external opinions. He could not change the fact that he is the son of a Greek, but he could choose to be faithful to his faith. This decision would have a huge weight later, when he needed to face much greater challenges within the early church. God was already shaping his character so that he would become a leader capable of dealing with different cultures and mentalities, remaining firm in apostolic doctrine. While many around him were concerned about status and social acceptance, Timothy focused on spiritual growth. He did not seek approval of men, but of God. What he did not imagine was that soon this stance would draw the attention of one of the greatest leaders of the early church, Paul. And this connection would change your life forever. The meeting between Timothy and Paul was not a simple chance. When the apostle returned to Stripe on his second missionary trip, he heard of a young man who stood out for faith and good testimony. The local church spoke of Timothy with admiration, which caught Paul's attention. And it was at this moment that something extraordinary happened. That young man, who until then lived a discreet life, was called to a journey that would transform his history and impact generations. But think of the size of this challenge. Timothy was young, with no ministerial experience, and was about to embark on a mission alongside one of the most influential leaders of primitive Christianity. It would not be just an evangelistic trip. It would be intensive training, facing huge persecution, challenges, and responsibilities. Many would have hesitated, but Timothy accepted the call without looking back. However, there was a practical problem. Timothy was not circumcised. This could be a major obstacle to the preaching of the gospel among the Jews, who saw circumcision as an essential sign of the covenant with God. To avoid barriers and facilitate their acceptance in Jewish communities, Paul decided that Timothy should be circumcised. Here we learn something valuable. Sometimes we need to give up certain things not for ourselves, but for the gospel to advance without impediments. Timothy understood this and, without hesitation, went through the ritual, showing his dedication to the mission. From that moment on, your life was never the same. He left with Paulo and Silas, facing tiring trips, cultural challenges, and, of course, opposition. But every city visited, each strengthened church, and each soul reached made the sacrifice valid. Timothy was being trained not only in theory, but in practice, living the ministry side by side with one of the greatest masters of the Christian faith. What began as an unexpected call would soon become a life mission. Timothy was no longer just a young Stripe. Now he was part of something much greater, the growth of the early church and the propagation of the gospel. But the challenges were just beginning. Soon he would face persecution and trials that would test his faith to the limit. Following Paul was not a mission for anyone. Timothy soon realized that the discipleship journey involved much more than teaching about the gospel. It was also about facing dangers, overcoming challenges, and staying firm even when everything seemed opposite. From the beginning, he saw the cost of serving Christ closely. They were not just beautiful words. The gospel required real sacrifices. He has witnessed constant prisons, persecution, and threats. In Philippi, for example, he saw Paul and Silas being unfairly whipped and arrested. What would have gone through your mind at that moment? Fear? Uncertainty? It was the first time he had seen the brutal reality of Christian persecution so close. But instead of discouraging, he saw something impressive in the middle of the prison. Paul and Silas sang praises. This episode marked deeply Timothy. Their faith was unshakable, and he knew he needed to develop this same firmness to continue in ministry. In addition to the external difficulties, there was also the internal challenges. Timothy learned from Paul how to manage churches, resolve conflicts, and fight false doctrines. It was not always easy. Some Christian communities were divided, influenced by wrong teachings or internal disputes. Timothy, although young, began to develop essential leadership skills, learning to deal with different profiles and complex situations. Another great learning was confidence in divine providence. Often they had no money, they had no shelter, and totally depended on the hospitality of siblings in the faith. Timothy saw closely how God supplied his needs, opening doors where there seemed to be no way out. This period taught him to trust God more than in any material security. Over time, the relationship between Paulo and Timoteo went beyond discipleship. Paul began to consider him as a son in faith, a true spiritual heir of his mission. Timothy was not just an apprentice, but a partner in the ministry. He had matured, faced challenges, and prepared for the great mission to come. And this mission would lead him to one of the most strategic places of the early church, Ephesus. By this time, Timothy had seen everything. But one thing was to accompany Paul and learn under his protection. Another, quite different, was to face the persecution on his own. And that's exactly what happened. When traveling with Paul, Timothy saw the fury of the opponents of the gospel and felt the weight of being a follower of Christ in a hostile world. One of the most striking moments was in Philippi, where he witnessed Paul and Silas being brutally whipped and arrested. Imagine being in Timothy Young, newcomer to ministry, seeing your mentor being treated as a criminal just for preaching the truth. That was the cost of faith, and Timothy knew that sooner or later he would also need to face this reality. In addition to physical persecution, there were also emotional and spiritual pressures. Many of the early Christians were discouraged in the face of difficulties. Some returned to ancient beliefs, others abandoned the call. As a leader in training, Timothy had to develop unshakable resilience. He has learned that true faith does not depend on circumstances, but on trust in God. There were also the challenges of dealing with the churches. Christian communities were growing, but faced internal problems such as divisions, false doctrines, and pagan influences. As a young leader, Timothy had to learn to face these issues wisely and firmly. And that required not only knowledge, but courage to position itself in the face of older and more experienced leaders. All of this was part of the training. God was preparing Timothy for an even greater mission. He was no longer just a disciple of Paul, but an emerging leader in the early church. And therefore, this spiritual maturity would be placed in the test in one of the greatest challenges of his life to lead the church of Ephesus, one of the most important centers of Christianity at the time. Leading a church is already a huge challenge, but leading the church of Ephesus? This required an even higher level of God's preparation, courage, and dependence. And it was exactly this mission that Paul entrusted to Timothy. The city of Ephesus was one of the largest shopping and cultural centers of the Roman Empire, known for its grand economy, diversity of peoples, and the famous temple of the goddess Artemis, one of the most influential pagan cults of the time. In the midst of this environment, the Christian church tried to strengthen itself. Timothy was now more than an apprentice. He was pastor of one of the most important congregations of the early church. But the weight of responsibility was soon felt. The church faced external and internal attacks. On the one hand, there was the persecution of the Romans and the Jewish religious leaders. On the other hand, the influence of false doctrines that threatened the purity of the gospel was growing. As a young leader, Timothy had to position himself firmly to keep the church on the right way. Paul knew the challenge was great, so he sent letters full of guidance. In them, he advised Timothy not to be intimidated by his youth, but to be an example for the faithful. The apostle also encouraged him to maintain apostolic doctrine and resist false teachers. For Timothy, these words were fundamental. After all, being young and leading a church amid so many challenges could generate insecurity. But he chose to trust God and follow the instructions of his mentor. In addition to preaching and teaching, the pastoral work of Timothy involved counseling, discipline, and organization of the church. He needed to deal with conflicts, help new converts grow in faith, and combat external influences. It was not an easy job, but Timothy was not alone. He had the Holy Spirit and the solid base he had received from Paul. His pasture in Ephesus was a period of great challenges, but also of spiritual maturity. Timothy grew as a leader and strengthened his authority among Christians. He was no longer just a young disciple, a fundamental pillar was stated in the construction of the early church. But the challenges didn't stop there. Therefore, he would need to face one of the greatest enemies of the gospel heresies. Leading the church in Ephesus was already a big challenge, but an even more serious problem began to grow heresies. Some people were distorting the gospel, mixing pagan teachings with the Christian faith. False masters arose who promised a secret and superior knowledge, influenced by Gnosticism. Others wanted to impose Jewish traditions as a requirement for salvation. Faced with this scenario, Timothy had to act firmly to protect the church. Paul, realizing the danger, wrote letters alerting Timothy about these false masters. He encouraged him to remain firm in apostolic doctrine and not to be carried away by profane fables. The message was clear. It was not enough just to teach the truth. It was necessary to fight the lie. Timothy needed to be a guardian of faith, ensuring that the gospel was not corrupted. Imagine the pressure that Timothy felt. He was still young, and now he needed to confront older and influential men within the Christian community. Some of these false masters had great charisma and persuaded many people with their beautiful words. But Timothy was not intimidated. With courage, he stood up to protect the church, exhorting the brothers to remain faithful to the truth. He also had to teach the church to discern the right one from wrong. Many Christians were new to faith and could be easily deceived by doctrines that seemed spiritual, but actually diverted from the gospel. Timothy assumed the responsibility of educating them, showing that true faith is not based on empty rituals or secret revelations, but on the work of Christ and the teaching of the apostles. This period has consolidated Timothy as a strong and respected leader. His faithfulness to apostolic doctrine assured that the church in Ephesus remained firm. He has learned that leading does not only mean motivating and teaching, but also having the courage to correct and face opposition. And this firm leadership would be essential to combat another great enemy of faith greed. Among the many challenges Timothy faced in Ephesus, one of the most dangerous was the influence of greed within the church. Some false masters not only distorted the doctrine, but also used faith as a means of personal enrichment. They manipulated the brothers, promising material blessings in exchange for generous offerings. Timothy realized the risk of this mindset and had to act quickly. Paul, knowing this reality, warned Timothy in his first letter, "Love of money is the root of all evils." This phrase does not mean that the money itself is bad, but that the unbridled desire for riches can corrupt the heart. And that's exactly what was happening. Many were putting their hopes in riches, forgetting the true purpose of faith. Timothy had to teach the church to see true wealth. He has shown that the Christian life is not about accumulating goods, but of seeking righteousness, piety, and confidence in God. He encouraged the brothers to be generous, helping the needy, and living with contentment. After all, what's the point of having many possessions and losing your soul? But don't think this fight was easy. Some rejected Timothy's correction, insisting that prosperity was a sign of divine favor. Others even discredited their authority by questioning their youth and experience. Even so, he remained firm, remembering that his mission was to please God, not to men. This struggle against greed teaches us an important lesson. The true Christian leader does not seek fame, power, or riches, but faithfulness to God and the gospel. Timothy understood this and led the church with integrity. His example proved that, more than material goods, what really matters is spiritual wealth. And his unshakable faith would soon become an even stronger testimony to everyone. Timothy not only preached about faith, he lived this faith unwavering. Amid challenges, persecution, and opposition, he maintained his commitment to God and the church. Even though he is young, his spiritual maturity made him a respected leader. He did not seek recognition or status, but served with humility, always placing the gospel above all. One of the greatest evidence of his fidelity was his permanence in the mission, even when Paul was no longer present. Many disciples diverted, abandoning faith in the face of difficulties, but Timothy remained firm. He understood that following Christ was not a matter of convenience, but of unconditional commitment. His example inspired the church, strengthened the brothers, and showed that faithfulness to God is worth more than any earthly reward. Paul saw in Timothy a true warrior of faith. In his letters, he encouraged the young man to remain strong, reminding him that God did not give us a spirit of fear, but of power, love, and moderation. These words served as fuel for Timothy, who learned to fully trust God even when everything seemed difficult. In addition to his personal faith, Timoteo was also an example in the way he led. He did not use his authority to impose himself, but gained respect for character and wisdom. His grazing was not based on empty words, but on a life that reflected the truth of the gospel. He showed that Christian leadership is not about power, but about service. This faithfulness and commitment made Timothy one of the most important names of the early church. His story proves that no matter the age, origin, or difficulties, when one truly surrenders to God, he uses this life to transform the world. But Timothy's greatest testimony was yet to come. Soon, his faith would be tested in the most extreme way: martyrdom. Timothy's faithfulness to the gospel cost him his life. According to Christian tradition, he died as a martyr in Ephesus, facing a rage crowd for opposing a pagan festivity. He was no longer a young disciple, but a consolidated leader, someone who dedicated his whole life to the mission Paul entrusted to him. His commitment to God was so deep that he preferred death to deny faith. It's hard to imagine the final moment of Timothy. Faced with the fury of those who rejected the truth, he could have retreated. He could have chosen to silence to avoid problems. But he didn't do that. Just as Paul faced martyrdom in Rome, Timothy followed the same way. His life was a testimony, and his death sealed his history as a true servant of God. The impact of his trajectory was not limited to his generation. His example of discipleship, leadership, and faithfulness continued to inspire Christians over the centuries. Their actions helped strengthen the early church and contributed to the preservation of apostolic doctrine. The letters Paul sent him today serve as a guide to pastors and Christian leaders, showing eternal principles of ministry and life with God. Timothy teaches us that following Christ is a call that requires courage. He did not have an easy life, did not seek earthly glory, did not accumulate riches. But he has won something much greater, a spiritual legacy that will never be erased. His name remains a living example of unshakable faith, dedication to the gospel, and commitment to the truth. And now, the question that remains for us is, are we willing to live with this same fidelity? Timothy's history challenges us to remain firm, regardless of difficulties, knowing that the true treasure is in God. Its mission has been completed, but ours continues. May your life inspire us to move on, always firm in the purpose of serving Christ. The story of Timothy is a powerful reminder that God can use anyone willing to serve him from the heart. He began as a young man of humble origin, faced challenges, learned from Paul, led the church in difficult times, and remained faithful to the end. His legacy was not built in riches or fame, but in the firmness of faith and commitment to the truth. Now, stop and think, what can we learn from Timothy? Are we really willing to put God above our daily wills and challenges? We often let ourselves be carried away by fear, insecurity, or search for comfort. But the life of this young leader teaches us that it is worth trusting God, even when everything seems difficult. If Timothy had given up on the first obstacle, his story would have been quite different. But he remained firm, faced the difficulties, and made a difference in his generation. Today, the same call extends to us. Are we willing to follow this example? Have we lived so that in the future our legacy is a testimony of faithfulness to God? If this story has impacted you, do not keep this knowledge just for yourself. Share this message with others and keep following our content. Subscribe to the channel and enable notifications so as not to lose the next videos. And remember, a new video is already appearing on the screen right now. Click and keep learning more about the faith and the characters that mark the story of Christianity. See you there.